Very, very excited about today's episode. We have Dr. Quentin Mackey, who is an associate professor. It's in the anthropology department, but you're an archaeologist, is that right?
That's right. Yep.
Okay. Are you specifically a marine archaeologist or a maritime, or is it marine or
Uh,
maritime archaeology?
no, not. I mean, I've worked on coasts, archipelagos the whole time, but
Okay.
certainly this, most recent stuff is the first time I've gone underwater, really.
Oh, really? Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
And so you did your PhD at Southampton, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. And so from the bio piece there, you've worked really extensively in this area of the world, in Haida Hawaii, and you're working with Parks Canada right now. Is that right?
Um, yes, I've done a lot of work with Parks Canada, but
Okay.
unfortunately, that's been tailing off a little bit. We hope
Oh,
it picks
okay.
back up,
Okay.
but cutbacks.
Gotcha. Fair enough. And yeah, so you, Vic, and welcome to the podcast, Quentin. I really appreciate you agreeing to do the interview here. So, um, so I found you mainly in the mainstream news. It was kind of for me, it was almost akin to a shot heard around the world, actually. And I know that media in Canada were quick to pick up the story. The Globe and Mail, allowing for some media embellishment, maybe. Titled their article, originally published in September 23rd, 2014, as "Underwater Discovery Near Haida Gwaii Could Rewrite Human History." Quentin, what have you found? Or what do you think you found?
Yeah, that's one of my favorite headlines. Because I think it wouldn't be the case of rewriting human history so much as writing some of it for the first time, or indeed rewriting or writing Haida history
Okay.
with a different language.
Okay.
Um, but anyway, yeah. So, well, we had an underwater archaeological survey project last summer,
Mm-hmm.
2014,
Okay.
and the premise of that study was that sea levels were much lower at the end of the last ice age. And and at that time, then large areas of the continental shelf off the west coast of Canada were dry.
Right.
And we have reason to believe, in fact, I think we know definitively, there were people on the west coast when sea levels were quite a bit lower
Okay.
than they are today. So that's always been a known thing, or it's been a known thing for a few years, but we still don't really have any convincing, unequivocal evidence from the seafloor itself of human occupation.
Okay. So,
So,
so is this changing that then, or what? Like, what did you pick up?
well, maybe I'll just set the table for you a little
Sure.
bit here.
Okay.
We've been working in, excuse me, been working in Haida Gwaii for about 15 years, and during that time, together with Daryl Fedge, who was a Parks Canada archaeologist for many years,
Okay. Yeah.
um, together he had worked out the sea level history in quite a lot of detail, and so we knew where sea levels were at different times in the past. We'd also explored some cave sites, which are they're on dry land,
Mm-hmm.
but we found archaeological remains in those caves of bear hunting practices that went back as early as 12,800
Wow.
years
Okay.
ago,
Okay.
maybe a little bit earlier.
Right.
And at that time, sea level was about 100 meters lower than it is today.
Okay.
And we had a couple more bits of information. One was in the 1990s, and then sort of periodically through the 2000s, there had been this high resolution seafloor mapping had been done. So
Right.
something called swath bathymetry or multi-beam bathymetry,
Mm-hmm.
which is accurate to less than a meter in all dimensions. So you have basically a contour map of the seafloor that you could resolve at about 50 centimeter contours if you wanted to,
Wow. Okay.
which is far better than your typical map of the terrestrial environment.
Right.
And on that map, you could see that while some areas had clearly been destroyed by rising sea level or had been reworked by rising sea level, there were large areas where terrestrial landforms were still clearly visible on the seafloor.
Okay.
And most notably of those, there were river channels. And these are unmistakable river channels where clearly caused by flowing water.
Right.
And producing deltas and little river terraces and braided streams and whatnot.
Okay.
And then finally, yeah, from those caves, we had also recovered a real lot of salmon bones, which we think had been taken into the caves by brown bears. And those salmon bones dated back to 14,000.
Okay.
So at that time, sea level was more like 150 meters lower.
Okay.
So in this little area of kind of southeastern Haida Gwaii, an area called Juan Perez Sound, through our work and work of others over the last 15 or 20 years, we'd really set the table. So we knew what the seafloor environment looked like. We knew where the river channels were.
Right.
We knew there were people when sea level was at least 100 meters lower. And we knew there were salmon that were presumably migrating in those rivers and being caught and taken to those caves by bears, probably not lugging them tens of kilometers over the landscape.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So probably all very close together in this area that's, maybe 5 kilometers by 10 kilometers.
Okay.
So that was the table had been set for doing some underwater archaeological work. And we had tried a little bit in the last 10 years or so. We had the Parks Canada underwater archaeology team had come out, and they're the bunch who do shipwrecks primarily.
Oh, okay.
We found the Franklin expedition.
So same crew then?
Basically the same crew. A lot of the same people, Ryan Harris, Jonathan Moore. And they came out, and the idea was they were going to dive at some of our more shallow water targets on the seafloor.
Right.
But it was a whole different kind of archaeology for them and for us. And we just didn't get a real lot of quality time on the bottom.
Okay.
And, really at that point, I realized that, wow, this underwater archaeology thing is hard. It's hard, it's expensive, it's time consuming, and you can ramp everything up and spend a ton of money. And it really just takes one little thing to go wrong, and you can lose a whole day or multiple days of research. So it's
kind of like being in space. Also, one thing can go wrong with your spacewalk, and that's it. The telescope gets lost, or you have to plan a whole new mission to fix it, right?
Or it's because human lives are at stake.
Right.
And this is what I really realized is those guys are putting their lives on their line when they get under the water.
Yeah.
It's fine for me sitting topside with a cup of coffee, sitting around thinking I'm pretty cool. But meanwhile, those guys have got a million things to think of.
Right.
And if something's not right or the conditions aren't right or whatever, and they have these charts that say if you're at this depth, you can stay down for this many minutes and so forth. And of course they, extremely responsible and safety oriented. So that, I guess my take home from that was, wow, archaeology underwater is hard, and huge respect for the people that, actually do it.
Right.
But it didn't mean that we were kind of, we still wanted to explore this lost world that was down there.
Right.
And the genesis of this project then was, knowing the table was set, and having had a little bit of experience with some aspects of underwater archaeology, then just by a series of coincidences, I got invited to give a talk at a conference in New Mexico, and what the topic they wanted was future directions in underwater archaeology on the West Coast. I'm like, hey, you guys, you got the wrong guy. Actually, they had the right guy, who was Lauren Davis at Oregon State, but Lauren couldn't do it.
Okay.
So, he passed the ball to me, and I was like, okay. So I, of course, any academic, I was kind of making it up on the plane on the way down.
Nice.
Yeah. So thought, well, what am I going to talk about? They want future directions, And so then I had this idea that, okay, the going down and actually getting samples from the seafloor is hard.
Right.
And the kinds of instruments that you usually use in, say, historical archaeology to find shipwrecks, like side scan sonar, they're not going to pick up what we would expect to be a typical site from 12 or 13,000 years ago, which would be, you might expect typically a little campsite with, you know, a hearth, maybe some places where the tents were, maybe some stone tools, but it's just too small and ephemeral to really be visible in the same way that if you're looking for shipwrecks, you tow your side scan around, and well, you probably saw the picture of the Franklin ship.
Right. Yeah.
You know what I mean? My 5-year-old could tell you that was a, you know, a ship. So I'm not saying it was easy, but it's different. But then I had this idea, well, what about sites from that ancient time period that would be visible to imaging technology? And I thought about fish traps and fish weirs as being essentially rock walls that are, you know, maybe knee high and can stretch for tens of meters, and standing proud of the seafloor, or, you know, what was then the river banks. So they'd be, you know, they had some good things going for them. They'd be in highly predictable locations on rivers, if their goal is to intercept migrating salmon.
Logical.
Which, and so now you've narrowed your search zone down quite a bit, which is good because the ocean's a big place.
Right.
And they should show up really nicely on side scan as a strong reflector, differentiated from the surrounding kind of bottom material, whether that's the old river or some kind of lag surface of gravel, or whether there's even some recent marine organic splooge laid down. They should still, if they're breaking the surface at all, they should show up pretty well on side scan.
Okay.
So that was the premise, was for my talk, was, okay, you know, here's like blah, 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 blah. Now the future, you know, thinking 5-10 years, I thought, well, you could get an AUV to patrol these river channels. So an AUV is an autonomous underwater vehicle. It's like a robotic, unmanned submarine.
Kind of like a drone for the water.
Yeah. You know, and and
don't say that to the military. They're going to do all sorts of bad things with it. I'm telling you right now.
You know, like the thing with the it's actually it's easy to understand thinking of it as a drone, but well, first of all, the AUV people hate it being called a drone, but I haven't broken the habit.
There's a whole ego thing associated with it being called AUV. Yeah.
I know, it's like you expect it to be painted dull gray, you know, with a, you know, take this Osama painted on the side. But no, the thing is, like a drone, drones are flown in real time by an operator.
Right.
These AUVs, because it's underwater, there's very limited bandwidth that you have with a vehicle that's not tethered by a cable.
Right. Okay.
You have very little bandwidth to control the thing, so you have to enter into it basically vector files, and it will fly along those vector files at predetermined heights.
Right.
And if it gets into some kind of trouble, like it doesn't know what it's doing anymore, or forgets, or you know, it gets too close to the bottom, especially, then it'll just abort.
Okay.
And it pops up to the surface, and you can reprogram it through the air, where you know, through wireless connection, you could reprogram it if it's on the surface. Anyway, okay, so those are autonomous underwater vehicles.
Okay.
So I needed a picture of one of these for my talk. So, like, again, like all, you know, academics these days, I just turned to Google image search, and I just wanted a generic picture, because I was talking about something that was going to happen 10 years from now by someone else, you know. And the first one that came up, I chose. Oh, that's nice, bright yellow, looks good. And it was only later, after I'd inserted it into my talk, and you know, I was just messing around after that, I noticed it had a UVic logo on the side.
Oh, gee.
Yeah. So, so this is how this whole project came about. Really, was that Google image search found me the AUV of my dreams. So when I got back from the conference, I made up an inter-office memo.
Yeah.
Found out who had it. It turned out it was mechanical engineering of all
Right.
people.
Okay. Yeah.
Sent them a memo that basically just said, "I want your drone."
And they said, "It isn't
and
a
they said,
drone."
"Sure." Yeah. Basically, they said, what I sent to them was like, you don't know me, and I'm just an archaeologist, and I don't have any money, and I don't have any skills. I've got an idea, so you want to talk about my idea? And they were like, yeah, sure.
Okay.
So I went over, I met with them. It was Colin Bradley from mechanical engineering, and one of his PhD students who's just finished, Alison Proctor. And so we sat down and I showed them the idea, and they were all over it. They loved this idea. They thought it was cool.
Okay.
Like, oh, cool. Because I think your machine's kind of cool. And but the great thing was that they turned around, and within a week, we had enough funding to do this project because they have an endowment in mechanical engineering, and the Ronald Ramsey Endowment Trust. And they applied to get some seed money from that.
Okay.
Not enough money. I mean, they already owned the AUV, which is $1 million gadget, but needed the money to be able to get it up and down, to hire an assistant for Allison and so forth. So
pay for gas on the boat, and
actually, that's where this kind of the third pillar of it comes in. We've been working in Guayanas National Park Reserve for most of the time. We worked in Haida Gwaii, so we had a good relationship with them.
Okay.
And I emailed them and said, hey, we've got part of this project figured out down here. We have money, we have the gadget, we have the idea, but we need logistical support, and in particular, a boat to operate this thing from. So it's 12 feet long, it weighs 500 pounds. You can't just sort of toss it in off a Zodiac.
Okay, yeah.
Well, the thing is, like the new ones, you can, because they're much more like 100 pounds and the size of a garbage can. But this one is a fairly serious bit of kit. So, Guayanas National Park Reserve. Then right away they said, "This sounds really exciting. We're really into it." And we arranged a window when they would put their supply vessel / research vessel, the Guayanas 2, at our disposal. So they gave us that vessel we had 10 days of ship time with their crew, and that's a 70-foot boat, and super capable of handling this kind of project. So couldn't have done it without Guayanas. But you can sort of see that like all the pieces kind of just fell together magically. And what went from an idea dreamed up on an airplane to a conference in that kind of white hot, desperate heat of what am I going to say, turned into an actual project of, fins in the water within about 7 months.
Wow.
So that never happens that fast. So the whole thing just completely fell into my lap.
Yeah, that's awesome. Wow.
Yeah.
Pressure can do wonderful things, right?
Yeah. That's right.
So you're out there, you're scanning along, and all of a sudden, bam, something pops up on the screen. Is it sort of like a Titanic moment, or what?
Not a. Yeah, you want to be careful with your Titanic metaphors.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Yeah.
The ATV did hit a large island at one point, which was kind of worrisome.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but
I thought it wasn't supposed to do that. I thought it was supposed to detect the bottom or whatever and abort.
Yeah, well, it looks down. It doesn't look ahead.
Oh.
It's a bit of a design flaw for something that's moving, but that's the way they're built. And of course, I mean, the problem there was that there was some, it's quite mountainous there, and it didn't get a good GPS fix.
Right.
It gets GPS fix on the surface, and then it relies on inertial sensors to keep track of where it is on the seafloor.
Okay.
Didn't get a good GPS fix, so it didn't know where it was, but it knew where it wanted to go, and it didn't know there was an island in the way. So anyway, it was fine.
Okay, good.
It's pretty scuffed up, but it was fine. Anyway, no, the thing with it again, because it's autonomous and it's down there on its own, and there's no bandwidth between you and it. Then you really put it in the water at the beginning of the day, and you pull it out again at the end of the day. So, because loading and offloading is the most hazardous time when you're trying to swing it off the boat without smacking it up.
Oh, okay. Fair deal. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's got this propeller, which is made out of plastic. But the propeller is worth $55,000. So it's like every little thing on this thing, is worth more than my salary.
A plastic propeller is 55,000. How big is the propeller?
Well, I'm sort of shortchanging it a bit. It's a vector propulsion unit, but it's in diameter. It's about the size of a dinner plate, so it's not a huge thing. But it doesn't have a rudder, so it steers by orienting this propeller, and that changes the thrust vector, and that steers the thing along.
Okay.
So it's fine tuned, but it's outside of the rigid plastic hull of this AUV, so it's quite vulnerable to being smacked.
Okay.
Anyway, so you put it in the water in the morning, you take it out at night, and it's not until then you plug it in, literally you plug it into an Ethernet cable, and you can download the data that it gathered for that day.
Okay.
So typically we'd be reviewing the data in the comfort of a warden's cabin on Huxley Island, with coffee and a wood stove and, the magic of Guayanas. And we'd be huddled, Daryl Feggi and I would be huddled over a computer screen looking at the previous day's side scan. It's actually a really efficient way of doing it because big parts of the bottom are kind of boring. And you can fast forward. Which, so far, we can't do that in real time, right?
Right, yeah.
Yet. As much as you may want to sometimes, but you can't fast forward. So you can if you're reviewing the data. So we were able to review say 8 hours of sonar. We could review it in about 3 hours.
Okay.
And we were trying to be very cautious as we're looking at this side scan, and neither of us are experts with side scan, although Daryl's looked at a fair bit over the years. But it's a bit like looking at a ultrasound image versus looking at a baby. It's a little bit grainy. It's kind of got that speckly, spackly look to it.
Right, yeah.
So you're not seeing a true image, and you have to realize, there's distortion, what the shadows mean, what the bright things mean. Kind of got to reconfigure. But also we were trying really hard to just, like your brain really wants to see patterns. It's like why you see faces in clouds, or, why you, not you personally, but why people, see Jesus in their toast.
He's there, Quentin.
Yeah, in their grilled cheese sandwiches. And
he's there.
If you get a Jesus in your grilled cheese, you can sell that for millions, I hear.
Yeah, because there was it Jesus or the Virgin Mary on a grilled cheese sandwich somebody unloaded for 50,000 or something like that?
It was something like that.
Someone on eBay? Yeah,
I know. I mean, that's God works in mysterious ways. So anyway, we're trying to be cautious not to overreact, and our first impulse on seeing anything was to just try to explain it away or whatever, and we got pretty good at that.
Okay.
But by the end of our time up there, we had a good handful, like 5 to 10 targets on the seafloor that kind of fit our expectations of what sites might look like with this imaging tool, the side scan, from that time period, that we couldn't really shake and we couldn't explain away super readily.
Okay.
So those are the ones that we now want to go back to.
So did you have anybody, so I mean, obviously you said you're not so much a specialist in interpreting these types of images, so did you pass them by somebody who was, like the underwater ultrasound tech, or?
Yeah, we have We have, um, you know, at this moment, no, we haven't yet. We do
Okay.
have a benthic geomorphologist specialist who's, basically a geologist of the seafloor,
Yeah.
who was Audrey Dallimore here at Royal Roads University in
Oh,
Victoria.
okay. Yeah.
And she was going to come on the trip, but then sort of fairly last minute, he couldn't come. So she's going to review the sonar,
Okay.
and also John Harper, who's also a kind of marine geologist, is going to look at it too. And I'm expecting that we'll lose some of our targets for sure. They'll say that's obviously a natural thing of some kind that we don't, know about being mere archaeologists. I don't think that we'll lose all of them.
Right.
It turned out that, like the whole plan was to look at the river valleys for fish traps, because that was the sort of, the archetype of a site type that might be visible directly to the side scan.
Sure.
But we gathered a lot of information as it flew around these river channels on the river terraces beside them, and we started to see a few sites, a few spots, I should say, that kind of resemble what we might expect with a campsite.
So what do you, when you say that, so I mean, the big one that they reported in the media was that you think you found the fishing weir, right?
Right.
So basically you're saying it looks like a big stone wall. Is that
Yeah.
kind of what,
Okay. So starting with that one, we like the truly kind of titanic moment would have been a fishing weir that was, clearly culturally constructed the way some of them are. That is, with a complex arrangement of stones, a double V shape or something with chevrons or big heart-shaped wing dams coming off of it. And some of the fish traps and fish weirs here from the recent past are really complex arrangements of rock.
Okay.
And if you saw one of those, there'd basically be no way it could be geological.
Right.
But, most of them aren't like that. And so we did see on one river channel. So you can see where the river channels are fairly clearly with the side scan in most cases. Like they show up typically as a kind of darker linear kind of, relatively parallel sided line wandering around as the AUV flies over them. So in one instance, then we saw a strong row of reflectors, so rocks. We could measure them with the little measuring tool. They'd be basketball sized, maybe yoga ball sized. I'd say there'd be several dozen of them at least that you could resolve. And they're forming a line at right angles to a stream channel, fairly small stream channel. And the line of rocks is, 10 or 15 meters long,
Okay.
but only about a meter wide. And so that would be quite consistent with a lot of, fish traps,
Sure.
fish weirs that we've seen in the last couple of thousand years. It's basically the archetype of what we're looking for.
Sure.
And the key thing with this one was that, there weren't a lot of rocks around in that particular part of the seafloor, possibly, excuse me, possibly because people had picked them up and built the weir out of them. But I wouldn't, go that far. But the interesting thing was it looked like the stream had not deviated around this line of rocks.
Yeah.
And that the implication of that, I think, is that the stream was there first.
Right.
And the line of rocks came there second. And
Sure.
I think if that line of rocks had just been there through some natural means, that the stream would have, flowed around it. It would have deviated and made a little kink or something, but it really didn't. So
I got to tell you, based on how you're describing this, having taken 2 archaeology courses in my undergrad and just, no geology courses whatsoever, the way you're describing this to me, it seems pretty damn compelling that this is
Well,
not natural. I don't know. It's a bit right
yeah,
angles and, designed out rock layers and lines along, engineered along a stream bed.
yeah, I know,
It
but
seems, I know you have to be cautious, but
yeah.
wow, I mean, it seems pretty compelling to me. I don't know.
Well, it's nature can work in straight lines too, especially where there's flowing water involved. And you wouldn't expect the straight lines to be at right angles to the flow of water, but
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah, I don't know enough about, say, fluvial geology
Hmm.
to be able to say like, oh, that's actually, it could happen really easily. But
Okay.
we have walked up and down a lot of streams looking for fish traps and fish weirs, and if we had found this in a contemporary stream, uh, just based on our look at it with the side scan, which is, like I say, not a perfect look, I think we would call it a fish trap.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But on the other hand, like maybe we're wrong about a lot of them from the recent past too. I don't think so, because a lot of them have wooden stakes and stuff.
Oh, okay.
So
Okay.
that was one thing.
Yeah.
That's the stone wall, and that's in about 122 meters of water.
So it's not very easy to get to.
No, it's not, and that would have last been exposed to air.
Yeah.
So, assuming people built it,
Yeah.
then if people built it and they needed to breathe air while they did it, then it would have been about 13,800 years ago that you could last have walked on that land surface at that spot.
Wow. Okay.
So,
So
yeah.
did you find anything else that was sort of compelling as well? So, or is that, would
Well,
you say that's the biggest piece right there?
no, I mean, we've got I was not expecting at all to be able to see organic stuff. Like a
Okay.
lot of fish traps, fish weirs, either are made entirely out of wood
Hmm.
or largely out of wood, wood and stone together. And they often then include stakes that are driven into the riverbed,
Hmm.
which you kind of can support a removable fence made out of wood,
Okay.
if you know what I mean. So just
Yeah.
imagine a whole series of fence posts with these removable panels, and the idea then is that you can direct the fish's movements that way. And it wasn't even on my radar, but it turns out that you can sort of see organic material with this side scan. And in a few places, we saw what we think are remnants of the forest floor.
Mm.
And we knew from work in the 90s, by Daryl and Heiner Josenhans from the Atlantic, ironically, the Atlantic Geological Survey. And I'd been involved with that a little bit. We'd done some dredge sampling in this area, and not to step too far back, but in 98, Daryl and his team found a stone tool on the seafloor at 50
Oh,
meters,
okay.
brought that up. And so that was, another clue that there could be stuff down there.
There's stuff there. Yeah.
But of course, the knock with that was always, well, it could have fallen out of a canoe. And it's true, right? It's true.
Yes,
could have fallen.
it certainly could have. Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and magically landed on a river terrace on the bottom.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's possible. So it's not as good as finding something that's more definitively in situ,
Right.
as your archaeology listeners will know.
Mm.
So, but also brought up with this big dredge sampler at that time, at a couple of different locations, there were tree stumps were brought up and remnants of the ancient forest floor. So at 143 meters of depth, very close to where we were working, there was a pine stump was brought up and its chunk of forest floor.
Mm-hmm.
And that radiocarbon dated to about 14,200, which is exactly right for the sea level history.
Right.
And there was all kinds of, little beetles and pine cones and needles and fungi and everything in it. So it was a pretty cool chunk of the seafloor.
Didn't find
So
an axe though, right?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, right. Or someone had carved, a little heart in it or something. But,
And if there was an axe there, it could have fallen out of a canoe.
Yeah, right. Well, yeah, that's, but it's hard to argue against that because
I
it's
know.
definitely possible, and
Yeah.
people would have been on the
Sure.
surface of that water
Yeah.
for 10,000 years, far
Yeah.
longer than they were on the seafloor.
Right.
And just, everything, like sooner or later, stuff's going to fall out of the canoe.
Sure.
Anyway,
Okay.
yeah. So we saw some stuff that looked like organic, foresty floor areas, but we also saw one spot where it sure looked to us like, and again, in the exact right location relative to a small river channel, that there was a double row of sort of disc-like organic sonar absorbers. So they show as dark spots on the side scan, where the sonar is absorbed, and that would be typical of, say, waterlogged wood, would kind of absorb the sound waves from the sonar, whereas rocks reflect it and they show as bright.
Right. Okay.
So, so we have another spot where it's possible there's actually, maybe just the tops of wooden stakes used to build part of a wooden fish trap.
Okay.
That's something like they look kind of like, if you squint a little bit, they're sort of in an organized double row of discs, and quite familiar to us as the way a lot of, again, fish traps from the last 2,000 years, the way that they look, not just on Haida Gwaii, but up and down the coast.
Okay.
So that's another interesting target. But we also saw interesting stuff on the river banks or the terraces above the waterways, in a few places that we found hard to immediately explain as natural. We have one that is, it's a kind of rectangular hole in the ground. It was a three-sided hole, so it's built into a slightly sloping terrace edge.
Okay.
And if you imagine it as a sort of side hill platform, excavated into the hill, then it's about 5 meters by 4 meters in size, and quite rectangular, really, when you look at it. And didn't see anything else like that down there.
Okay.
It's at about 55 meters.
Yeah.
It's far too big to be one of these dredging sample grab things.
Okay.
The dredging bucket, it's not from that. It's not a trawling mark. It's not an anchor mark. It's hard to explain. But it's in a place that if, you could drain the ocean, you would, and walk around, you say, that's a place I would go look for archaeological sites.
Okay.
So southwest facing terrace,
Yeah.
where a small river met this ancient lake that used to be down there. Kind of, it's got a good aspect, very protected, confluence of water bodies, like I say, south to southwest facing. And that kind of hole in the ground, you can look at things like in the Aleutian Islands, and in parts of the Arctic, people would build houses as into the side hill.
Oh, okay.
As a rectangular hole.
Yeah.
So that, the front of the house wouldn't be underground at all. The back of the house would be, be up to your chest or something.
Okay.
That provided insulation and so forth. And then they'd build the roof up there. They'd build it out of whalebone and skin or something.
Okay.
But at the time of, say, 55 meters, that would correspond to about 11,900,
Okay.
12,000 years ago.
I was going to ask you how old that would have been. So, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that would have been the last chance to build it. It's at least that old or older, whatever that thing is, if it's a terrestrial process, whether human or something else. But the forest cover was, not as dense as it is today.
Okay.
And things like cedar, red cedar were not yet available. 14,000 years ago, you get the first trees on Haida Gwaii, and 12,000 years ago, you have spruce and hemlock in addition to pine, but it's maybe more of a parklandy, somewhat open forest. anyway, so you're going to have different building materials and so forth available, better
Sure.
than the Aleutians for sure.
Okay.
But a sidhill house like that is not unknown in the last 10,000 years of BC archaeology.
Okay.
So it's about the right size, it's in a great location, it's oriented in the right way. And again, it's kind of hard to explain immediately as the result of a geological process.
Right.
It's not like it's a steep slope or it could be a mini landslide or
Yeah.
anything like that.
Okay.
So that's a place we'd like to go back to. There's another place that it looks like there's some kind of rock arrangements on the ancient beach and sort of rectangular clearing of rocks on an otherwise bouldery terrace above it. Yeah, like again, your brain wants to find stuff,
Yeah.
like it wants to find the Virgin Mary in your toast or a face on Mars or what have you. But we were trying to be pretty consistent and fairly rigorous about rejecting what our brain wanted us to
Yeah.
find.
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
So, I've got a hunch that our kind of 4 or 5 top targets that there maybe a couple of those survive the geological scrutiny.
Okay.
And will be places we'll want to go back to.
Fair deal.
We'll want to go back anyway for different reasons, but I think we'll definitely want to go back and explore some of the targets we got from this summer.
A little bit more in depth. Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm just gonna kind of go sort of mainly talk about the weir, but I guess maybe, some of the other things that you think you may have found down there. What sort of technical sophistication would somebody have to have, in order to build something like a fishing weir and to know, sort of the construction method and the engineering and how to place it and that sort of thing? I mean, because you wouldn't necessarily think that up overnight, right? Like that wouldn't, it would take some practice, obviously, wouldn't it?
Yeah. That's a good question. I don't think that, especially the rock weirs, I don't think that they're very sophisticated technology in terms of like you have to have some special cognitive insight or whatever. Remember we're dealing with, anatomically fully modern human beings, Homo sapiens.
Sure.
And so they have the smarts. One thing about fish weirs is they're found on all the continents. You get them in Australia, you get them in Africa, you get them in the Pacific Islands, all over Asia, Eurasia, and North and South America. So they're really very widely distributed. And that, makes you think, as an archaeologist, that they're either very old technology that people carried with them, maybe out of Africa even, as an idea that this is something you can do, and where the conditions are right, implement it. Or there's something that's just like trivially easy to invent, and it got reinvented all over the world multiple times.
Okay.
So I think either of those two explanations would argue that it's certainly not impossible for people at that time and place to have fish weirs.
Okay.
Admittedly, like they'd be the oldest known ones, archaeologically, they'd be the oldest known ones, or at least that I know of in the world.
Okay, well, and that was the other piece of this I was going to ask is like, what does this mean? Okay, let's enter the land of, the underwater or the underwater ultrasound techs here, the geologist, the marine archaeologist, everybody signs off, says, what? You found something here. You've got this weir. You have, maybe a little bit more work, says, you've got some other things around here that are compelling. What does this mean in the grand scheme of what we understand about the history of ourselves? Like, this is, like, it's not just, I didn't even know what you would compare it to. It's not just some run-of-the-mill archaeological find that, you necessarily would, expect at a certain area. Like, is this a game changer?
Uh, I think that mm, I think that archaeologists would find it, interesting for a number of different reasons. One being that it's just really old. Uh, it would just it would just be really old evidence for this kind of fishing technology,
Okay.
and it's an interesting kind of fishing technology, not just because it's visible, to side scan sonar or whatever,
Hmm.
but because uh, it makes it much more possible to mass harvest, these resources like salmon that are extremely abundant, but not year round. So there might just be a few weeks of a hyper abundance of salmon. And during that time, you've got to catch as many as you can
Sure.
and store them for the winter, say,
Right.
or you have that option. So catching them, one at a time with a hook and line or with a spear or something is fairly time consuming in its own right.
Sure.
Whereas what a fish weir can help you with is that you can, intercept hundreds or thousands of salmon at a time, kind
Okay.
of corral them up,
Yeah.
and then take them out with nets, or
Hmm.
it's more like shooting fish in a barrel if you're
Right.
supposed to harpoon them.
Yeah.
Um, so that has implications for people's way of life, for how mobile they have to be,
Hmm.
for how much time they have to sit around in the winter and just tell stories or make art or whatever.
Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting from that way, in that mass harvest and storage is something a lot of archaeologists think of as a bit of a prime mover of social change, cultural change in the past.
Okay.
Um, the people that are interested in how and when did people first get to the
No, that
Americas,
was going to be my next question because I, yeah.
yeah, it's got some implications for that potentially.
Okay.
But
What's
I mean,
what's
we do have two sites that are quite close to me here in Victoria
yeah.
that are, you know, one's a mastodon kill site, and that's 13,900 years old.
Okay.
And there's a bison kill site, about 13,700 years old. That
Okay.
one's on an island, even. Um, and, so those are comparable in age to the dates we're talking about for this underwater stuff.
Okay.
So I think like kind of knowledgeable archaeologists will be, okay, that's cool. If this stuff holds up, they'll be like, that's cool. We have some more data points.
Okay.
I do think it's a bit more attention grabbing because people think, oh, the drowned coastal plain, will never find any archaeology on that because it's all been destroyed by rising sea levels.
Yeah.
I don't think that's true. I think there's big chunks of it that survived being,
Sure.
transgressed. But I think that it's a bit more, of a, it would have the potential to get people feeling seriously optimistic about doing continental shelf archaeology out here.
Right.
Um, I don't, I see those connections, and obviously, I'm not oblivious to the work in relation to the peopling of the Americas thing.
Hmm.
Um, but I mean, I think like what we've always been doing up there is archaeology of Haida history
Right.
and Haida Nation,
Yeah.
um, trying to tell part of the story of the Haida occupation of Haida Gwaii.
Okay.
And so, for me, that's the most important
Piece of it.
thing with this
Yeah.
research is, just more information about Haida history during this time of tremendous geological transformation.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that would have
Sea
been
levels were rising
yeah.
5 centimeters a year,
Yeah.
every year for 3,000 years. And what it did to you, or to the world you were living in, was radically transforming that world. And at that time, new plants are arriving. The forest arrives for the first time. It goes from a grassland to a forest. Species that were there go extinct or are extirpated from Haida Gwaii. So the faunal regime changes on those islands. And it's a really interesting time in Haida history, and one that is present in Haida oral history as the time of transformation, when Raven changed the world from its old way to its current way, you could say.
Okay. So what is sort of just to touch on it here, just to put it in a bit of context. So what is the conventional, theory about the Haida and the settlement of the Haida in the area in terms of timeline and process and that sort of thing? What does that look like?
Well, the Haida, as I mentioned, we have sites on Haida Gwaii already at 12,800, which sea levels are 100 meters lower. If you drop sea levels 100 meter, you open up a huge area, probably 50% bigger landmass of Haida Gwaii, because the seafloor around it to the east is quite shallow, flat, and if you drop it 150 meters, you pretty much join Haida Gwaii to the mainland. So knowing there's people on the, like I said before, we know there were people on this drowned landform because they would have had to walk around on it to get to these caves that are now on islands, but would have been just mountain ranges in the distance from the ancient shorelines. In terms of, actually putting, sorry, I'm kind of like, I lost what your question was there.
Oh, just sort of the timeline and the process, of the settlement of the Haida in the area.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, so Haida Gwaii is kind of, it's an interesting area to a lot of different disciplines. It's the most remote part of the northwest coast in terms of its isolation from the mainland, and it has on it a kind of very unusual set of plants and animals that have for a long time encouraged researchers to think that there was a glacial refugium, or an area that wasn't glaciated or not completely glaciated, in which plants and animals could have survived the sort of, mass destruction that the coast saw during the height of the last glacial period.
Okay. Kind of like Cypress Hills, not too far from where I'm at. There's in eastern Alberta and southwestern Saskatchewan, there's a whole series of plants that are, you'll find nowhere else in the world because they were spared any cataclysm that was going on. So that's interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So the Haida people themselves, linguistically, Haida is maybe the single most distinct language anywhere in the Americas.
No.
There's been at least one study where the kind of take-home message, if you like, was if you had to divide all the languages, all the indigenous languages of the Americas, of which there's like 4,000.
Right.
If you had to divide them all into two piles, then you would put Haida in one pile and you'd put all the others in the other pile.
Why?
There's,
what accounts for that difference?
Suggestive of a very long period of linguistic isolation.
Okay.
There's, and other people say, well, actually, you know what? It's very distantly related to some other language, but they're still basically making the same argument.
Sure,
no one really denies that Haida is more or less a linguistic isolate. And incidentally, the other two major languages of the North Coast, of the matrilineal societies of the North Coast, which would be Tlingit and Tsimshian, are also linguistically extremely distinct and sort of isolates in their own right. And that suggests, again, there's a long period of isolation between those languages and any other languages they're related to, and also between those languages and each other. I mean, they have loan words and so forth to each other, but fundamentally they're as different as English is from Chinese.
Okay.
And yet they're cheek by jowl up there on the North Coast. So that suggests a long period of isolation. And genetically, Haida people are quite genetically distinct.
Okay.
Some various studies on that. And there they are out on their own little archipelago.
Right.
So, I would say that it is strongly suggestive they've been there for a really long time.
Right.
And the archaeology shows that people have been there for a really long time.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of other lines of evidence come together, I think, to suggest it's ancestral Haida that have been there for a really long time. And it's not a place that's seen a population change or shift, probably since the last ice age.
Okay.
And whether there were people there before the last ice age, I kind of doubt. But I think
why do you doubt that?
Well, I think, I'm just not really convinced there were people anywhere in the Americas before the height of the last glaciation.
Which was when? Which?
I'd say like 20,000 years ago.
Okay.
And there are always some candidate sites, but I think currently the sites with consensus around them would date to something like 14,500, 15,000. One of those, of course, is in, quite close to the southern end of South America. So that's interesting in its implications.
Well, yeah.
But one thing about, those sites and a kind of emerging consensus in archaeology of the Americas is that the idea that people first came to the Americas through an ice-free corridor through what is now Alberta, that's really very few people would hold that belief anymore.
Okay.
And that was a pretty strong embedded conventional wisdom for a long time. Yeah. And surely there still was an ice-free corridor that at some point opened, but the increasing evidence is that got populated from the south to the north, and there were already people south of the ice sheets. So if they didn't come through the ice-free corridor, then it raises the question of, well, how did they get south of the ice sheets?
Sure.
And, a lot of attention then has been sort of turned to the west coast, which has always been a proposed route, but there was never really much consensus around it. And, in fact, when the ice-free corridor model was so entrenched, it was almost like heresy in the discipline to talk about the West Coast route, because that was supposed to mean that you were somehow ignoring a bunch of evidence and riding some kind of hobby horse.
Yeah.
And it's true that there really wasn't a lot of evidence for it. And it's really hard to show a route, but also in truth that there was a lot of reasons to not believe the ice-free corridor route, even while it was the dominant paradigm.
Right.
So I think it would be more honest in the discipline if for the last 100 years, and including now, if we said we really have no idea how people got to the Americas, or when, or how, or why, that would be a lot more honest.
Okay. Yeah.
But as long as we're trying to solve that problem, which I don't feel particularly like I am, but as long as we are, then people are looking at the West Coast route, and that's when it gets interesting, when you see these populations with such long lineages, like the Haida, and like I was alluding to, Haida history starts with the time of transformation, and I don't know if on the older $20 bills, there was Haida art. There was Black Canoe, and there was also a picture of a raven on a clamshell, and there's humans emerging from the clamshell. And that's the origin story of Raven was walking around the world. So a series of stories linked together is known as Raven traveling or Raven walking stories. And he has a series of adventures with supernatural beings. Mm-hmm. And he alters the world through these interactions. And one of the things he does is he's just walking along, and he hears these noises coming out of a clamshell. So he goes over, and ravens are very curious. He's like, "What's up with this clamshell?" He opens it up, and out come the people, and those are the ancestral Haida. But if you read the written down accounts of this, or one of them, that was a story that's recorded by an anthropologist called John Swanton in about 1900. It's even like it's literally on the same page as Raven is releasing people from the clamshell. On that same page, it describes that Haida Gwaii was close to the mainland.
Okay.
And that Raven pushed the islands apart with his feet. So he pushed Haida Gwaii away from the mainland, which is a kind of, a sort of vivid metaphor for the sea level rapidly drowning Hecate Strait, what's now Hecate Strait, but was the Hecate lowlands of Haida Gwaii.
Right.
And it says at that time, Raven sorted out the animals and said, "Oh, these are the only animals that are going to be on Haida Gwaii, and they're the animals that were there historically."
Yeah.
But other ones like brown bear, like deer, were extirpated from Haida Gwaii 13,000 years ago.
Okay.
And he says, at that time, says very explicitly, or the storyteller John Skye, as he told Swanton, he said, at that time, meaning this time when humans are being released from the clamshell, at that time there was not a tree to be seen. And we know that 14,000 years ago it was a grassland with the first trees arriving. And that's kind of a weird thing to say without some sort of, historical basis, that here you live in the luscious forest in the world in some ways. And your origin story tells of the islands being much closer to the mainland and the grassland and stuff. So I think that is just one more line of many lines of evidence that archaeology and Haida history are kind of telling the same story in parallel.
Yeah.
And that the story that's being told is one of very, very deep history of the Haida Nation. And that's also then reflected linguistically, genetically, in their own histories. It's reflected archaeologically.
Yeah.
And it's just a really, it doesn't need to be part of some bigger story of the Americas, It's a cool story that I don't think really has a parallel that I know of anywhere in the world where you can be talking with even a small degree of confidence that oral history is telling of events that happened 14,000 years ago.
Yeah.
I mean, it's pretty wild when you think about it.
Well, it is, and I appreciate that you actually that you do take account of that, because I know in other areas of the world it's been a bit of a contentious issue in archaeology and in the history of human development. Is in a lot of places they don't. They don't necessarily take a picture or take account of the narrative of the people that they're, one of the big hot button areas I know where this is particularly the case is in Egypt. And, there's a lot of controversy about, disparity between the narrative of the development of the people and then, and sort of what the more modern archaeological perspective is trying to say, and then square the two together to come up with with an accurate picture of Egypt. So I don't know. I appreciate that. That's an important part of the equation. So
I mean, it is definitely not the role of archeology to somehow validate oral history.
No, but it's important to take account of it, though, right?
I know you weren't saying that. But just to be clear, they're just telling of parallel stories of the past, and there may be points of intersection.
Sure.
Where it's something is being told in common through two very different kind of narrative languages.
Right.
And you know, the thing is, like, the oral history though does a lot more than just tell of events that happened. Um, you know, it has a lot more weight to carry for people. And so it can't just say, well, this is just like a series of events, but it's kind of a metaphor for people's entire cosmology and way
Right.
of being
Yeah.
and morality and their ethics and their way of being in the world.
Yeah.
So there's an awful lot in oral history which isn't sort of about literal historical events,
Sure.
but is talking about things that are just as important or more important to the people.
Mm-hmm.
The sort of historical underpinnings of them as a people. So that's why it's really a good idea for archaeologists not to kind of walk in there a little too boldly and say, well, you know, this part's true and this other part's a bunch of BS, because
Well,
that's completely missing the point.
yeah, and
So,
that's where I think a
you
lot of
know,
people get into trouble. So,
yeah.
yeah.
But I was glad to see, like, in reporting on this, at the Haida Nation website,
Yeah.
haidanation.ca, they reported on our most recent work, and they contextualized it in terms of the time of transformation and raven walking.
Okay.
And so, you know, I thought, well, that's, to me, that was the coolest
Sure.
of the media coverage, was
Yeah.
the way that it was kind of brought full circle. And you know, and so another, just a bit of a tangent here, another thing that Raven gets up to
Yeah.
in this time of transformation was he brings fish traps to the people. So yeah, stone ones and wood ones.
My.
Yeah, I know. So it's like, when I'm thinking to myself, like, is it plausible? Is it possible that there were fish traps on Haida Gwaii that long ago when we don't have any other evidence of that, or any other evidence anywhere in the world? You know, I've got a fairly strong belief that Haida oral history starts at least 14,000 years ago.
Yeah.
And at that stuff that is marked off as being in the beginning
Right.
includes fish traps.
Yeah.
So that adds to my into my confidence,
Right.
you know, that there could well have been the use of fish traps at the time of transformation.
Fair deal.
Yeah.
Quentin, I know we have to wrap this up. I just have I just want to bounce the ball in one quick area that we went to, and I know you're a specialist in terms of the Haida, but you'd also mentioned, you know, we're talking very briefly about the peopling of Americas. I know the traditional perspective has been that, you know, there's sort of one source, you know, peopling of North America. Is that changing now? Are people in the discipline of archaeology more open to the idea that maybe there was multiple sources of colonization of the Americas? And, you know, with the uniqueness of the Haida, would that play into it? Would that be potentially a source of evidence for that? Or is it still very much, no, everybody came in over the Bering Land Bridge and that's it?
Yeah, well, that how long have you got? I think there's
as long as you want, Quentin. I got all day. So
I hope you speak for your listeners. But you know, one thing that I've learned with the rise and fall of the ice-free corridor model and the associated Clovis archaeological culture type,
right,
and the kind of, I think it's fair to say, emotional investment that a lot of archaeologists had in that model,
right,
that led them to over-police the boundaries of what could be talked about or proposed.
Gotcha. Okay.
Makes me not at all wanting to prematurely shoot down any idea.
Fair deal.
Because, you know, so I think that that, having said that, like, I feel that current evidence is most consistent with, multiple peopling events or multiple populations, but probably in a fairly narrow window of time coming across or out of Beringia. Like you said, Bering Land Bridge, and this is like one of my, pet hobby horses.
Sorry.
You could say, it's fine because that's the way it's talked about, right?
Sure, yeah.
But I mean, the Bering Land Bridge was the size of Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta.
Right.
And so it's not a bridge, it's a subcontinent.
Right, okay.
And a bridge implies people getting from A to B.
Right.
But Beringia was a place to be in its own right.
Fair
it was
deal.
a homeland for people, and there would have been thousands of people there. And all kinds of cultural diversity and all kinds of stuff happening up there, and different populations and a melting pot and who knows what else.
Right.
So Beringia was a place to be, not just a means to an end. And so it's very kind of like Americocentric to think of it as a means to an end, when really it was its own means. And equally, the postulated West Coast route is seen as, it's like you talk about it as a route, as a corridor, as there's this idea of there's Kelp Highway, and all these, these are all ways that you get from one place to another.
Right.
You go down a corridor, you go along a route, you go down a highway.
Yeah.
You go across a bridge. Actually, the Northwest Coast would have been a place for people to be.
To be, right. So it's the imagery is wrong. It's
the way that we talk about it linguistically actually really matters.
Right.
Because if you start thinking of it as a homeland, then what you become interested in is the long-term history of the Haida people.
Right.
Let the peopling chips fall where they may.
Yeah.
So in any case, to get back to your question, then, I think that the current situation can be explained by people moving from Central Asia, Northeast Asia, probably with, a pause in Beringia, you could say, and then movement south into the Americas, probably sometime by some route or multiple routes, sometime around 17,000, 16,000 maybe.
Okay.
And that I don't really see the need for, like, there's ideas right now about the so-called Solutrean hypothesis, where there's European discovery of the Americas, and that's the progenitor of Clovis culture. So people coming across, the ice sheets of the North Atlantic from Spain, what's now Spain or Portugal, it's like, wow, I just don't see the need for that, because that's all predicated on on stuff we no longer believe.
Right. Okay.
And there's some interesting technological parallels, but it's kind of veering into the sort of Thor Heyerdahl thing. So I don't see the need for it, but if it turns out there was cultural contact that way, then that would be super cool.
Sure.
But I think the evidence is consistent with, the overwhelming kind of input into the Americas coming from Northeast Asia, and a lot of the sort of things that at first seem to be a little out of place or strange, like some of the skeletal material from Brazil, can just be explained as don't underestimate Beringian diversity or early Homo sapiens diversity as they came through Asia and had long-standing populations and all kinds of interactions and niches. And so I think it fits. The story fits with an Asian origin, Northeast Asian origin. I'm partial to the West Coast route, but it's something that I don't expect to see solved, in my lifetime.
Fair deal.
Like, how do you if you really want to say, well, this is conclusively how it happened, you would need like a whole series of sites dating to in the right order. The oldest one, in the northwesternmost, and the next oldest just south of that, and then just south of that, right? All the way down to South America or whatever.
Yeah.
It's just calling for evidence that's going to be astonishingly hard to produce. And the nature of the beast is that you never know if you found the first of something.
Well, and I was going to say 7 months ago, Quentin. Who did you know that you were going to find this? I mean, maybe you got the ball rolling down the hill here. That's
Well, other people have been, trying to do a bit of underwater archaeology as well.
Sure.
So, I don't know, like, yeah, because like I said, I definitely do not think of myself as an underwater archaeologist.
Fair deal.
And I think we're almost certainly going to have one more field season. We've got some of the pieces in place already to go back with different instruments to our hotspots,
right,
as well as to look more generally at places that just look like good landforms. And so I will definitely give it one more crack and see where it goes. But I wouldn't be surprised if I talked to you in 3 years if I was back into my comfortable dirt holes with a tarp on top in the rainforest somewhere. Because I just think that I can do a little bit of this stuff, but it's really not my training and expertise. And I'd love to see other people pick up the ball and carry it forward. But we're talking about a lifetime scale project.
Yeah, it could be a lifetime pursuit.
So when the Globe and Mail says like one potential thing rewrites human history, that's kind of what I feel is like we're not rewriting it. We're writing it for the first time, and there's going to be a lot of scratching out.
Sure. Yeah.
As you go along in your first draft of anything.
Yeah.
And this work may well get scratched out. It may expand into a paragraph. It may shrink to a single word. We don't know yet.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Well, that's fair. Well, Quentin, I appreciate you've been very generous with your time, and I really do appreciate you coming on to the podcast here. So thank you. Thanks again. And I know you were interviewed out when I first initially contacted you. How many interviews you done on this?
I don't know, probably 25.
Okay.
25 maybe, but none for a while. And,
okay.
And this has been great to be able to talk at greater length. So thank you for having me.
Well, our pleasure. And maybe down the road here, once you said you're going out for one more crack at this. Is that?
That's our plan and our hope, and we do have some of the pieces together to do it. But to get back up there next summer.
Okay. Yeah.
And you can really only work up there in the summer.
Fair enough. Yeah.
And try to get back to some of these places we think look good.
Okay.
And try to get some samples from the seafloor, get some high definition video, and just try to figure it out. And we may not even then be able to say definitively, yes, this is cultural or this is natural. So I'm quite prepared for that. But on the other hand, we might be able to say for some of them one way or the other.
Maybe you'll find a UFO.
Yeah, and maybe in that.
And it fell out of a canoe, so
there'll be some kind of manuscript in there that I could read.
There you go. Yeah, get some documents going here in a jar or something. Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, maybe we'll be in touch here for next summer and see how things are going if that works for you. So.
Yeah.
Cool.
So good.
Great. Well, thanks again, Quentin.